just give us another couple of minutes, okay? 2 minutes more? Okay, thank you, voice of God, whoever that voice is. This is our last session, formal session for today. I appreciate everybody coming back inside during the rainstorm. I did not time the rain to get you inside. I'm simply going to introduce our terrific moderator for the session, and he will introduce the panelists, and we'll move forward. So we're very, very grateful and lucky to have Riz Khan from Al Jazeera with us today to do this session and then the program over dinner. Riz has been with the BBC, with CNN. He's done more than 1,500 interviews at different times with CNN and others of world leaders, presidents, UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, Dalai Lama, Nelson Mandela, just to name a few. In 2005, he joined the Al Jazeera network to set up its English language channel, Al Jazeera English, and he hosts its flagship program, which is a daily live topical show that features the world's top newsmakers. We're very happy to have you with us today, Riz. Welcome to the stage.
Bob, thanks very much for that. I'm always worried when there's applause before I said anything because it kind of preempts what I'm going to say, I think. I'm going to actually ask the panelists to come up and I'll introduce them in just a second. So, Ben and Gary, please come and grab a seat. Excuse me. Can you get in? Okay, there we go. Oop, knock this down. I'll get to Ben and Gary in just a second. But as Bob said, I'm Riz Khan, and have been working with Al Jazeera now the past 5-6 years, having helped set up the English language channel. Usually when I talk about Al Jazeera in America, and I do some conferences in America, but I usually tend to do conferences overseas, it's not so bad. But here, people run for the doors. I think since Hillary Clinton said it's not as dangerous as people think, it's helped us a lot. So times have changed. We don't have to lock the doors anymore. But I do say that the word "the" has become the most dangerous word in the English, in the language, the English language right now. If you say it in Arabic, because if you say "the" in Arabic, it's simply "al." And if you add "al" in front of anything, it suddenly sounds dangerous. You have Al-Qaeda, Al-Aqsa, Al Jazeera. So, but I remind people, of course, you had Al Gore. And started with Al Capone. But there was a time when Al represented something positive, because you had alchemy, algebra, alcohol, actually. It's true. The alcoholics laughing there. Anyway, so it's an interesting time, of course, and the Al Jazeera reference was because of course, Al Jazeera was in the center of a very interesting time in the Middle East with the Arab Spring and reporting the Arab Spring, which no doubt we'll get into the debate at some stage. Considering the internet has grown so rapidly as a communication medium, more than any other technology in history, it's caught many governments and authorities by surprise. The traditional media, newspapers, radio and television, have largely been the target of authorities who want to control the message. And it took some time for them to realize, wait, people are communicating and planning and mobilizing through this lesser understood medium and all that it brings. Well, that lack of centralized control is perhaps what's allowed it to develop so organically. Without an international body to regulate and standardize the network officially, up to now, the governance has been divided among a patchwork of public and private organizations, and maybe to some degree by individuals themselves. But there are mixed views on how to move forward, with some wanting a much more centralized control system, while others favor this current organic system. There's always a danger in mixed messages, by the way, I always say, especially when politicians are involved. I was recently with the British Prime Minister, John Major, who's a lovely guy and very funny, actually. He always says how difficult it is to get a straight message out of politicians. And he always quotes a time he was with the former Russian President, Boris Yeltsin, visiting him at the Kremlin. And he said, I thought I'd test Yeltsin with a question, and said to him, if you could describe the economy of Russia in one word, what would you say? And Yeltsin said, good. He said, how can you say that? It's falling apart, isn't it? All right, if you could use more than one word, what would you say? And Yeltsin said, not good. So you can see the challenge we face. Well, the International Telecommunication Union, the ITU, a specialized agency of the United Nations, has been set up to oversee information and communication technologies, and there's been a call recently for light regulation of the Internet. I'm quoting the Secretary General there. What exactly does that entail? Russia's current president, Vladimir Putin, wants negotiations to end with the ITU, given the power to monitor and supervise the Internet. His country is often criticized as one that stifles free expression. Of course, China gets accused of that a lot as well. So what does a more centralized system mean for the world of Internet users? What do you think is better? We have a chance here in this discussion to get your views in as well. Should it be more centralized? Should it be more organic, or remain organic as it is? I'll give you a chance to get your questions to our panelists in just a second when we open it up for Q&A as well. But let me introduce them formally now. They've been sitting with me. To my immediate left is Ben Wagner, who's researcher at the European University Institute in Florence and coordinates the Dynamic Coalition on Freedom of Expression at the Internet Governance Forum. His research has covered trade in censorship and surveillance technologies and on the Internet freedom strategies in international relations as well. Gary Fowley is with us. He's the head of the liaison office of the International Telecommunications Union, an agency of the UN, as I'd mentioned. He spent more than 10 years as a news and current affairs producer and reporter for CBC Television. He'll give us a great perspective on where the issue of the ITU and these calls for regulation come in as well. I'm going to kick off with a couple of questions, but then very much open it up to you. So let me start off with that. And perhaps, Gary, the best way is to get a perspective on what the ITU is about, because not everyone really fully understands what it's there for, its origins, and what it's aiming to do.
Thanks, Riz. Well, let's start with the origins. You talked about a patchwork quilt. We'd probably be the oldest piece in that patchwork quilt. The ITU was formed in 1865 as the International Telegraph Union. It really wasn't until the invention of the telegraph that there was a need for a multilateral stakeholder treaty that dealt with issues beyond military concerns. It was with the invention of the telegraph, we realized that there needed to be sort of standards and ways to ensure that interoperability and connectiveness worked, expanded, and people benefited from that growth. That's been the basic principle of ITU since the beginning. That's changed, like our name did, from the International Telegraph Union to the International Telecommunications Union. We deal with, under treaty, the spectrum that electromagnetic spectrum, which manages all the wire and wireless connectivity. if you want to put a satellite in orbit, you have to have a slot on from the ITU. And we've dealt with standards. So anything that runs on the need for spectrum, anything that has standards, not anything, but most information communication technologies, including the Internet, at least at the transport level, depend on ITU standards. But we're only one of many players. We are a member-based organization, member-state-based organization. As Riz said, we're a UN specialized agency, have been since 1947. We have 193 member states, but we're also the only UN agency that has sector members. These sector members, there are about 700, include private sector members like Microsoft, Intel, Cisco. We haven't been able to get Google into the fold yet, but now that they've gone into the mobile business, maybe they'll come and join us sooner than later. We also do provide sector membership to academia and to ITU or ICT-related telecom. So NGOs. So that's what we do. And I think you're going to find my response to this question kind of disappointing because it's hard to argue with success when it comes to the Internet. 20 years ago, we lived in a world where where most people did not have access to even the most basic telecommunications. Today, there are more than 6 billion mobile subscriptions, and almost 2.5 billion people have Internet access. And a great deal of that success is related to a treaty that deals with international telecom regulations, the ITRs. And this is where I think part of this confusion that we want to manage the Internet comes from. The ITRs is a treaty from 1988. They came into force in the 90s, early 90s. It's been, how many years is that? 30-plus years since that treaty came into force. At the time, what governed telecommunications was place, location, and distance. That's all changed. Yes, there are more IP protocols that are operating out there. We need to respect that. We need to find a way to ensure that the interconnections and the interoperability of the telecommunications network survives. This conference, which everyone is referring to, and many of you have heard of, which will happen in Dubai, is not about Internet governance. I don't know how many times I'm going to have to say that in the next half an hour, but it's not about Internet governance. It's about connectivity, establishing a framework so that infrastructure will be supported. We're looking at up to an $800 billion shortfall in infrastructure. We want to keep the mobile miracle alive. We're going to have to find a way to build and extend that infrastructure. So there's a bit of background.
Actually, a quick question about that $800 billion short by 2015, presuming the demand grows the way it is.
Yes, that's a number that came out, I think, at the Mobile World Congress a few months ago.
Gary, you'd said that there's a lot of confusion about the regulations, the ITR. What about the ITU itself? What do you think is the most misunderstood aspect of the ITU?
Well, I think, that somehow it's a monolith, that there's this group of people that meet behind closed doors and that have no responsibility to anyone else but themselves, and that's not the case. This is a treaty-based organization of the United Nations, and like the United Nations, has 193 member states. At the end of the day on the treaty, yes, they're going to be the ones that sign. But sector members, civil society has to have input. We're the UN agency that brought and have been bringing the issues of the information to society to the world for quite a while, since at least the mid-'80s. We've looked at the divide between the access between the developed world and the developing world. It was an ITU resolution that created the World Summit on the Information Society that was a UN summit. That gave birth to the Internet Governance Forum, which is the forum in which, Ben's actively involved in which has become the forum in which all the stakeholders can have a say on Internet governance. Telecommunication regulations are a different thing. Spectrum is a different thing. ICT for development is a different thing. But there's three basic principles that we need to adhere to. And, you said we want to regulate it. Well, there's a need. If there's any regulation for telecommunications, it really does have to be, light-handed. It has to be forward-looking. It has to be transparent, because we need an efficient framework for investment. That's what the process is there. It needs to be even-handed in the sense that it needs to make sure that the least amongst us, the least developed countries and the developing countries, have an equitable stake in the information society. But one thing that people need to realize, too, is that the ITU as a UN agency, it has a responsibility to uphold Article 19. And we were talking this morning about constitutional guarantees, the First Amendment. Article 19 in the UN Charter of Rights and Freedom says you have the right to hold and express opinion across all media and all frontiers. That's a very broad guarantee, I think. And I think what we're seeing with the Internet, and maybe this is the scary part, is the first real challenge of Article 19. Because as an infrastructure, dare I say utility, it's unlike water, power, and transportation, not so easy to control at the border. So it really has attracted that kind of attention. It's something we all can benefit from, but we all have to manage.
Gary, thank you. It gives us some perspective for our discussion as it goes on. Let me bring in Ben Wagner here. And, of course, Ben, you know a lot of this from the inside. What is done with the Internet right now? How much real regulation is there?
Well, I think it's a difficult question in the sense that you can't say how much regulation is there or isn't there, because lots of the Internet just happens. There's various different organizations that are in some way or another multi-stakeholder fora. There are national governments at some levels regulating in certain spaces, but in general, most parts, states have been left out.
Bring the microphone down a little bit, just so we can hear better.
There we go. That better?
Down a bit towards you, yeah.
There we go. And I think in most parts of the Internet community and in the world in general, there's an agreement that part of the success of the Internet is that states have been left out so far, and that states haven't had a hugely significant role in its development. And of course, this then leads to certain suspicions or concerns when states are then seen to take a more active role. And I'd say that it's an extraordinary contrast. You mentioned the Internet Governance Forum. I had the interesting experience of taking part in the World Telecommunications Policy Forum, which is an ITU event in 2009 in Lisbon. And it was an extraordinary contrast. I went to the Internet Governance Forum the same year. And at the Internet Governance Forum, it's normal that a group of stakeholders sit together at a table, discuss issues on an equitable basis, and try and develop different types of Internet governance concepts. Whereas at the World Telecommunications Policy Forum, which was at the time, I was told, going to be this multi-stakeholder forum, so I thought, great, wonderful, we can go there and you can really sort of discuss some of these issues. And then there were, I think, I lost count. It might have been 12 or it might have been 14 lines of sort of state delegation, state delegation, state delegation. Then came the last row, state delegation, then the press, and then behind the press, with all due respect to the press, civil society. And civil society was sort of tacked on at the end, but didn't really feel like they were part of the process. And so I realized this is an ongoing development, an ongoing debate that we have on what the future governance model for the Internet should be, and that there's many different fora and spaces to develop different things. At the same time, the greater involvement of states is almost automatically, there's like a reflex which directly causes concern.
Well, that's the nature of the UN model in some ways. It is a member state-driven organization. But as you've said, Ben, it has to be, a tent under which everybody feels that they have a part. And that was really the first big challenge for ITU, to do that with the World Summit on the Information Society, which I think was successful in that sense. We managed to get everybody in under that tent. Everybody had a say. The Internet Governance Forum came out of it. But it is a member state-driven organization, and they are going to have their say. And as long as spectrum is involved, where member states do have a right to license that spectrum to develop their industry, we can help guide them, and civil society and the private sector definitely needs to help guide them on how that's best developed.
Ben, let me ask you how you feel the Internet would be compromised if some kind of more formal system of regulation is set up.
Well, again, it's a very broad question, and it's hard to develop specific answers to that. But in a general sense, there have been a lot of proposals in the last few years that have raised eyebrows in many parts of the world in regarding giving either a more centralized system or a more formal role for states and intergovernmental organizations. And given that what we've seen the Internet can do, and given many of the developments that have been extraordinarily positive in the last few decades, as you mentioned, both in mobile and in fixed-line spectrum, it would be extraordinary to give all of that up simply because certain organizations have decided now. This is far broader than the ITU. There's numerous proposals here that are on the table suggesting that there should be a greater role for states, that they should be more involved. And the question is then, what can be gained from that? And also, if that is then to be the case, how can it not break many of the things that we've come to love and expect from everything that we know and works so well?
Let me ask you, though, to answer that issue that Gary had raised about the $800 billion shortfall in infrastructure, and that perhaps some kind of more structured system would allow money to come in, that the investment could come in under this.
Well, that's one way to consider it, but I don't see that there's any disagreement in either the developed or the developing world, or if those worlds even exist anymore. I'm not sure. I think in the modern world it's just there's lots of countries, lots of states. But I think the divide that is created by that and the need for investment is the wrong one, because there's this separation between these two worlds, one which is developing fast and the other which already has far higher levels of internet and telecommunications penetration. There's also a strong divide that increasingly becomes obvious, especially on the internet and with its multi-stakeholder governance model, which is the divide between states and their capacity to represent their citizens and equitably develop policy for all of their citizens, and other stakeholders who also have a say in that decision-making process. So I think it's important to consider several different divides in here. And I think that a multi-stakeholder model is also the one most likely to develop the investment necessary to bring that model forward.
Gary, you talked about light touch, quoting the Secretary General of the ITU, Dr. Hamadoun Touré, saying light touch regulation would be something considered. What exactly does light touch mean? How would you define it?
Well, I think light touch means something that's going to encourage investment and basically not, kill the goose that laid the golden egg, and enable us to ensure that the mobile miracle that we've seen and the mobile broadband internet, which I think is really where the future lies, doesn't disappear. We need basically principles that outline a transparent, sort of efficient frame for investment. How can you invest? Who can invest? How can that best be laid out? I think, Ben, it's a multi-stakeholder model. And if you look at the history of ICT networks and their development, this is my opinion, and I stand to be corrected. I think it's maybe the oldest and best example of a private-public partnership in many ways. Public sector had rights to that spectrum, but if you do it, you had to do it right. You had to certainly have an open, regulatory, transparent licensing system, or the private sector would not come in and invest. And if they do invest, you'll gain from the benefits of the information society. If you choose to take that money and put it in your back pocket, why would the private sector want to come? So yet the public sector, the government, the member state can put provisos on that. We'll give you this license. We encourage open competition, but you have to hook up our schools. You have to hook up our health centers. So there's a give and take in it, but it's got to be even-handed, and it's got to be fair, and it's got to be an open framework. There's no doubt about that.
But Ben, respond to that before we open it up to questions. Any thoughts on that?
Well, there's several points. I mean, you describe it as a public-private partnership, which itself, for the model of the ITU, is quite possibly one of sort of the earliest types of that model. But I think it leaves out quite important other components as well. If you look at the multi-stakeholder model, it explicitly includes the civil society participants, the technical communities, and at least from a lot of the concerns I've been hearing in the last few months on these issues, is that even the invitation to participate in a process that is maybe then claimed to be transparent is seen as dangerously co-opting civil society actors. And when they feel that they're not even able to reasonably participate in a process which they could in any case only have an advisory role, it's sort of difficult for them to interact at a level that would be seen as reasonably multi-stakeholder.
Point well taken. I mean, we need to find a way to engage civil society and incorporate that feedback. I would take one exception to what you said about technical, marginalizing technical input. That's not the case. In terms of our standards, we have three bits of business: spectrum management, radio communications, standards, that's where the industry comes in, works on a standard together to see what benefits so that they're including. The challenge is civil society. This is a science and technology organization of the UN. It's not, its community of stakeholders has been science and tech and government. Civil society was something new. So that, and I mean, not that new. It's always obviously been an important player, especially the private sector. But you know, you can't have an open, you can't have the benefits of the information society without having that involvement of civil society. And the fact that the very technology itself is empowering civil society to demand that they be heard. And that's the best thing about it. I think it's a bit, we were talking earlier, it's kind of ironic, but it's important that, you know, you're using the technology to make sure that the people that sort of develop that technology and the standards and spectrum or use it for their best purposes.
We'll have a chance to pick up on more of these in just a second, but let me open it up now, because of course you're our participants and it's really very much about getting your voice heard as well. So if you put your hands up, we do actually have a microphone there if you do want to line up, but I'll also get microphones out to you as well. So okay, let me just get to this gentleman first, then I'll come to you, sir.
Hi, I'm Baron Soka, Tech Freedom. Gary, thanks for coming and addressing us. It's brave of you to do. It's not a friendly audience. So, but I'll try to open this up with a gentle question. So I think a lot of folks here, both in this room and in the U.S. in general, but also in lots of other countries that value Internet freedom, are really concerned when they hear that it's Vladimir Putin and the Chinese government and others that have been encouraging the ITU to get more involved. Do you understand the concerns that raises, and how would you respond to us and to the general preference that I think many of us have, which is that, to paraphrase Winston Churchill, that the current multi-stakeholder ICANN process may be the worst form of Internet governance, except for all the others. In other words, that any sort of intervention by the ITU, while there might be much to be said about it, that would be good in theory, would in practice end up turning into a vehicle for control by authoritarian governments that don't value freedom in the way that at least has evolved in the case of ICANN.
Well, great question. I mean, put it bluntly, you know, the Russian Federation is one of 193 members. And as are others who may wish to have expressed or wish to express their desire to take control of what, or have more influence on what has been rightfully said, a multi-stakeholder entity. Within, you know, you don't hear that, and at the end of the day, the member states are going to look at that and find a way to come to terms with it, because it has served us all well. But there are concerns. I mean, you have to put yourself in the place, I'm not saying of Russia, but especially the developing country, where as the Internet becomes really more of a public utility and important to their economic development. We heard this morning 26% of GDP growth in the developing world is based on the Internet. You can understand why there might be a bit of frustration. Here's this important utility that, you know, you have limited say over. But I think the need is to find consensus. ITU has always operated by consensus. If it came to a vote, I don't think that would be a good thing. Consensus is a challenge, as is any treaty. And when we have something that's so important to all of us in 193 member states, it's going to be a great challenge. But it's not one that hasn't been overcome before. So hopefully,
one quick response.
Just briefly. So I think a lot of people are not going to be particularly assuaged by that. I think that the concern is that you're still talking about taking governance and giving it to governments. And that the UN in general demonstrates that, you know, if a handful of governments can build coalitions and build a majority of governments most governments in the world don't care about freedom at all, or Internet freedom in particular. So to say that it's just Russia and China and that there are lots of members doesn't really address the concern that transferring control to governments is going to make things worse from the status quo, where governments have a limited role.
Nobody said control was going to be transferred. This is not about Internet governance. I mean, this is about maintaining the health of a telecommunications system that served us all well. Yes, some governments may want to try and impose their desire to have more control. The issue we talked earlier of cybersecurity is one that, you know, people are going to talk about. But at the end of the day, this is about making sure that there's a framework in place that will support a mobile broadband future that I think we see coming that will benefit all member states. And at the end of the day, the citizens of the world will have their say. Whether or not their member state's going to listen to them is another question, but it's one that I think we need to respect that, and we need to understand where that's coming from. But this is not about no one is suggesting that power should be transferred at this point. Now, this is going to happen. These regulations are going to be discussed in December. The treaty will be reevaluated, redeveloped, and signed or not signed. Member states will have reserve that right, and there may be many reservations, there may be none at all. Hopefully, it will be a consensus based. But your point's well taken. But I think the research that's showing the importance of it as an open, transparent system that enables all of us where many players, including the ITU and ICANN and others, have a very significant part to play. There's no desire to jeopardize that, I don't believe.
Let's get a quick response from Ben on this, from what you're hearing then.
Thanks. Just 2 points. I think there's the question of effects here or impacts, and I think the point that this is not supposed to be about internet governance in December is well taken at the conference. I think what still sort of leaves a certain uncertainty is that could you also say that it will have no effect on internet governance at all? And the second thing related to that is that there's, apart from the effects question, the nature of the ITU and the way it functions, as you mentioned, is this public-private partnership, also creates certain obstacles to participation and to transparent process. The World Bank recently decided to take all of its reports and publicize them as Creative Commons on its website. That's potentially a process that could be valuable for the ITU as well, and shows that there can be a very valuable argument in opening up these processes and getting input and getting a type of participation that's only possible if you take the documents and put them out there for the world.
Right. And obviously we have to look at ways to incorporate that. I mean, it's good engineering. You have to have a feedback loop here. Where's that feedback coming from, and how can it be enhanced? So we need to find a way. Yeah.
But you sure it will then have no effects on internet governance? Or?
As we said, the old parameters of time, distance, and location have pretty much disappeared, and there have been replaced by things like IP protocols, and that in itself is an issue of internet protocols. So I don't, I can't. I do not have the crystal ball on this. 193 member states do, and the group that's managing this, the council, it's called the Council Working Group. Their report will be made public at some point, and we will, see what their sense is.
Thank you for your patience, sir. Tell us who you are, where you're from.
Sunil Abraham from the Center for Internet and...
Keep speaking. We'll just try and make sure we get your microphone. Yeah, that's it.
Sunil Abraham from the Center for Internet and Society in India. I'd like to thank Ben for celebrating the multi-stakeholder model at the IGF, but most governments feel that the IGF does not address what they see as a policy vacuum. The promises of enhanced cooperation have not really gone anywhere. So what do you think of the Indian government's CIRP proposal? This is the Committee for Internet-Related Policy. Thank
you. Again, to respond directly, I think that the first response is, states are getting involved in this. Is that a good thing? I mean, it's almost like a reflex. The second response, once the first response has subsided, is that none of the models that we have that are called multi-stakeholder are perfect. And I think this can be seen both at the Internet Governance Forum and at ICANN and many other spaces. But as was mentioned in the question beforehand, so far, they may be the best thing we have until we develop the next best thing. And there's going to be an ongoing debate on how those models can be developed forward. Enhanced cooperation is part of that. And we will need to take the concerns both of states in the developing world, but also of civil societies and of other actors in the developing world seriously if we want to develop that to a point where it produces something that fills the perceived vacuum.
Ben, a quick follow-up on that. I mean, if there is no formalized structure for government involvement, governments could still get involved in a covert way. If this general idea that governments is kind of anti-freedom of expression, there's nothing to stop governments from being involved in a much more secretive way and actually manipulating from behind the scenes. Surely a formalized structure would be a way to actually regulate what governments do.
But again, I mean, multi-stakeholder doesn't mean that governments aren't involved. It means that they're part of the decision-making process like any other actor. So the beauty of it is precisely that then you have the governments at the Internet Governance Forum or at ICANN, and they participate in the process. And they participate like any other actor. So it's not that they're not at the table, but it's that they have a different role at the table. And I think, with all due respect to the many governments of this world, they have plenty of spaces to voice their opinions. It's not as if we lack information on what governments think. And I think you're a very valuable part of ensuring that government opinions are heard in this world.
I think
good and not good.
You know, that's why the principle of Article 19 is really so important. You know, you have the right to communicate, hold opinions across all media, all frontiers. Now, of course, there's a proviso on that says, you know, national security concerns may be considered. But because of the technology, because of information communication technologies, you know, how true those security concerns are can much more easily be exposed and, or understood and challenged. And, you know, if there hadn't been a smartphone or a cell phone there to record Mohammed Bouazizi when he set himself in flames outside, you know, the government office in Tunisia because he'd had his permit to sell fruit and his scale removed out of frustration, you know, that might have been swept away and we wouldn't have discovered it. So that's why this principle, I think, has. You know, we're talking Science and Technology Agency. What do I know from human rights? But I do know that people have a fundamental need to communicate, and that right to communicate, I think, is best expressed in Article 19 in many ways.
Okay. Thank you for your patience, sir.
Thank you. My name is Ahmed Shopon from Bangladesh. Now, thank you. This is a nice debate indeed. The question is actually from civil society side, as human rights activists, many of the civil societies. I mean, there are, even in the UN process, there are real multi-stakeholder approach, while there are civil societies hold symposium and put their opinion with the legal process. But in regard to the ITU, you know, in the WSIS process, we observed that the civil society had a voice and put things together. But in the IGF, you know, almost, you know, there is the huge vacuum. While just we get together and then we came back. But where does this end to? That is one. And the second question is, in the country level, while we'll talk about the global system, and then the many countries, they have a sort of repressive law and regulations. And then how does ITU respond to? What measures they can take? But on the question, actually, the issue, that there is no global communication without local communication. And when we talk about centralized system, essentially it means, you know, the governance issue. And there is the decentralized, we talk about decentralized for better governance, for better served. So there are tricky issues, you know, that because on the one hand, the country system, the country ownership issue, while the countries should be, I mean, and on the other hand, the global system. How do we respond to and make balance between the two?
Let me get Ben to answer the first part, where you're talking about the sort of coming together and nothing. Well, where is it leading, basically?
Where it's leading is towards better developed and towards more advanced multi-stakeholder models. As I said, I don't think that anybody has the perfect solution to this. And part of the reason that there has been, let's say, what Sunil described as this vacuum, this perceived vacuum there, is because some of the multi-stakeholder models aren't there yet. It doesn't mean that they're completely broken or that they're unable to solve the problems at hand. It just means that they're in a development process. And I think it's valuable to keep on pushing them. At the same time, the second part of the question I found particularly interesting, particularly considering the events that we saw in Cairo, and we were discussing this beforehand. The ITU must, or as an organization, must have enormous difficulties seeing one of its member states cutting off the internet and telecommunications, as happened in Cairo for several days. So I would assume that both the process that's ongoing now and the sort of the debates that are happening at the council level, as you suggested, will ensure that things like that can't happen.
Well, I think point well made. And in terms of that question, I think what we can do to ensure that doesn't happen, and we do believe in the right to communicate and that people should express their Article 19 rights. But if you're going to introduce, you want the benefits of the information society, you want the benefits of ICT, you need to institute what's regulatory reform. The private sector needs to be assured that when you put out a call for auctions on licensed spectrum, that your investment's going to be treated with respect, that there's going to be an assurance that that money doesn't end up in somebody's back pocket. And if you encourage robust competition, not just create another one, monolithic agency or service provider, you're going to have healthy competition, and you're going to have a way to bring down prices, increase access, and as I said earlier, put provisos on that licensing so that everybody can benefit from it. Those in the, I'm from Saskatchewan in Canada originally, which is, not your most populated province, but Saskatchewan, there's Plentywood, Montana, and Bengoff, Saskatchewan are about 10 miles apart. In many ways, they're a long ways apart in terms of access, because in the United States, sometimes getting access in far-off parts of the country, there's a divide, within the country. Same thing in Canada. So we're seeing those kind of development divides happening in the developed world as well. But you have to have competition. You have to have private sector investment.
So thank you for your patience.
Yeah, I'm Milton Mueller at the Syracuse University School of Information Studies and the Internet Governance Project. I have a question for both of the panelists, if that's possible. For the gentleman from the ITU, my question is, you started out by promising that that WCAT 12 was not about Internet governance, and then we proceeded to debate whether the ITU would be a bad thing to govern the Internet. So my question is, what authority actually does the ITU have over the Internet? As I understand it, the ITU is about layer 1 and 2, that is the physical and data link layers at best, hardware, those kinds of things.
Spectrum.
Spectrum, which is layer 1. If you decide that you want the Internet to be governed in a certain way and half of the world doesn't agree with that, what can you do about it?
Well, if half the world doesn't agree, there'd be no treaty to do it, would it? And that's the point I was making. We see a multi-stakeholder entity that has benefited many people, but what we need to see, and we're not talking about Internet governance here. We're talking about telecom regulations. If the discussion becomes one on Internet governance, well, that will be for you, me, and the rest of society to educate, I guess, the member states on what exactly, how the Internet works, because I think there is, a level of uncertainty, about exactly how it works, and nobody has given us the power to do that. Nobody has said there is no provision in a treaty for us to do that, and that's not what we're talking about in December. We're talking about telecommunication regulations.
Good. So if I could follow up with Ben. Please do. So, Ben, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with the counterposition of multi-stakeholderism as the alternative to the ITU taking over the Internet. First of all, if the debate's about centralization, what could be more centralized than ICANN, which is multi-stakeholder? And secondly, aren't there certain things that just shouldn't be governed at all? Like, I don't care if the people censoring my website have come to a multi-stakeholder consensus or not. That was a question, I guess.
He's speechless with emotion.
Beautiful. Well, I'm just trying to imagine the multi-stakeholder censorship mechanism we would use to implement censorship on Milton's website, so I'm sure that would be great. That's either ICANN as a centralized model of multi-stakeholderism, if you want to call it that, or the IGF, or any of the other multi-stakeholder platforms out there are either perfect, or that they need to govern anything and everything, is, I don't think, a particularly reasonable conjecture. I strongly believe that there's ways of developing that. At the same time, I don't want to be standing here and beating the drum and saying multi-stakeholderism is the only possible option. It's completely possible that in many spaces of the way the Internet works, things simply work and things happen and things can be developed between reasonable people without the need for any regulation at all, which isn't to say that there may be spaces within which there are perceived or real lacunae or spaces where things need to be done. And in that case, again, be wary of the state.
Well, folks, unfortunately, we're out of time. I sneaked in a few extra minutes, and I know there's a lot more debate to go, but...
It's okay, go ahead.
We're okay? Okay, good.
A couple more questions.
All right, good. That's good. I don't have the authority there, but I'm being regulated nicely. Thanks.
Charming.
It's a light touch.
There you go, thank you. Thanks. Thank you, please.
Hi, I'm Cynthia Wong with the Center for Democracy and Technology. And first, I just want to thank the distinguished moderator and the panelists for being willing to come up here and engage on this issue. I think it's one of great importance. I have a comment and then a question mostly directed at the gentleman from the ITU, but Ben, feel free to weigh in as well. I mean, we've been talking a lot about the other bodies that have helped bring the Internet into what it is today, a platform for human rights, a platform for commerce and development. And if you look at those bodies, they tend to have several attributes in common. They tend to be open. They tend to be very inclusive. They tend to be decentralized and transparent in their working methods and consensus-based. But consensus-based means involving viewpoints of many of the different stakeholders who have expertise to share on whatever the subject matter of the body that is working on. And there's been some direct concerns raised about the working methods of the ITU itself, which may not exactly share some of those attributes of those other bodies. There's restrictions on the documents that are being used to prepare for the treaty negotiation. It's very difficult for civil society to understand what's going on. And some of those concerns have been raised last week by a group of about 30 human rights NGOs in an open letter that was released last week. And so I'm kind of curious as to get a response to that letter, which basically asks for more direct civil society participation in the process and for the ability for us to better understand what might be at stake. And just one additional comment, if you'll allow me. Although the words internet governance might not really be a part of necessarily the official document that is leading up to the treaty negotiation, I think the media has really made it clear, the reports, that many of the member states that are involved in the negotiation process are interested in doing things like cybersecurity and online data protection, spam, other issues that are very core to the functioning of the Internet. And I think there's a lot of expertise that necessarily hasn't been brought to the table quite yet. So.
Excellent comments. Thank you. Perhaps, Gary, I could go to you first on that issue of the transparency factor and the sort of greater clarity.
Mm-hmm. Well, the letter was well received. You know, it is up. The rules of this game are set by the member states. So you can be at least assured that the letter that the civil society sent will be, communicated with the member states that govern the ITU and that have set up the rules of the road. So this is what we need. They need to be told. We need to be told how important transparency is. I can't, that's all I can do to assure you that those voices are being heard. I mean, the proof will be in the negotiations. But again, of course, people have brought up other unrelated issues, but the principles that are defining this treaty are well defined and, deal with international telecommunication regulations. I think if people go too far off that track, there's not a lot of appetite for that broadly. But these are issues that have to be discussed going forth, have been discussed in the past, and will be with us as long as we have a utility, or as well as we have an Internet that's really becoming more and more a global infrastructure that we all see utilitarian benefits from.
Well, Ben, the second part was interesting there too, about the need for utilizing expertise better when it comes to cybersecurity, spam, and so on.
Right, but I think that again comes down to a question of openness at the end of the day. I think the more prepared and willing you are to be open on those issues, the easier it is to get different and diverse forms of expertise, often specifically from voices that aren't heard. Of course, that then means that a certain level of organizing that information is necessary, but again, that could be valuable. I just wanted to come back to one point that you mentioned before, which I thought was quite interesting, which is that you mentioned that if there was a question related to if this becomes an issue of internet governance or something like that, then we need to educate the ITU member states on how the internet works or how it's run, if I understood you correctly.
Well, I think we all could use
society,
I think
right?
we all need to better understand how the internet operates. I think that, like anything, there is a level of misunderstanding, expectations that aren't fulfilled. There are technical aspects of this that are very difficult for people to understand, and I think we need to do, we being the global multi-stakeholder entities that have created the internet or have helped to develop it, need to do a better job of communicating exactly what it is. That's what I meant.
Perhaps guidance is a less scary word than governance. I don't know. Maybe it's a different approach.
Education. Education is maybe even a better word. I don't know.
One last question, actually, please. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, I'm Smar McCarthy from IMI, based in Iceland. So Milton actually asked the core of my question, but there's a specific aspect of it that I kind of felt needed a bit more discussion. So whenever I hear the word multi-stakeholder, I feel a bit violated. And this comes from the fact that whenever there's, and this is a criticism of the IGF, the ITU, it could easily apply to any of these bodies, ICANN, WIPO, etc. Whenever they come together, it's normally delegations of representatives representing each other and not representing us. And what I'd like to know is, can either of you see a future where we can move towards a more democratic model of actual user participation in the decision-making, where things such as, the ITU's interest in command and control type regulation of the private sector in particular, for the protection thereof, doesn't really give a lot of leeway for things like unlicensed spectrum, for shared spectrum, for community broadband, and so on. So I'd like to know what you think about that.
First, I'll go to Gary first on that issue of the kind of level of stakeholder participation and the diversity of it.
Well, I think there are a couple of very good models, and the U.S. government provides one of them, Canada, the European Union, where at the end of the day, yes, it is the member state that signs the treaty, but they bring into the discussion from a very early stage and through the process a broad range of representation. I know in the State Department group, there's representatives of dealing with accessibility and gender issues. They reach out to the private sector, and I think all those global entities that have, established very strong regulatory structures that encourage open consultation and transparency, they're doing that. So maybe that's the beginning of that movement, but at the end of the day, as it is now, it's the member state that signs the treaty. And that shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody here, but maybe it does still.
And a final thought on that?
Well, again, I'd like to come back to your earlier comments, which I thought was very valuable on educating either ITU member states or more generally people who are involved in this process on
more generally,
I'm sorry, on how the internet works, and that this is a communal effort, that is not any specific individual's job, but that we as a community of people who care about this thing need to go out and do, and that as a result of that, hopefully the appropriate topics will be discussed in the appropriate fora, and none of the concerns will be founded, but that certainly this year at least remains to be seen.
One thing, irrespective of how much regulation there is or not, the internet can still prove to be a challenge through user error. And I always illustrate it with a story, and I'm sure some of you have heard this, about an elderly couple that decided they'd go down to Florida for their 50th wedding anniversary, and decided they'd go back to the same hotel where they first went out on their honeymoon. 50 years later, they go back to the same hotel. So the way the schedules were, the husband was going to go down first, and the wife would join him a couple of days later. So he went on down there to the hotel and suddenly found actually the original hotel had been knocked down, and just a little bit further along on the same street was the new hotel. So he checked in there. And though they were in their 70s, they were very active with the internet and very happy to use new technology. So he decided to send his wife an email. And as I say, she was supposed to join him a few days later. The thing is, in typing, he made one small typo in the email address. And instead of sending the email to his wife in Washington, D.C., it went to a relatively young woman in New York who'd just been suddenly widowed. So in his house in New York, this young boy heard his mother sort of scream and collapse on the floor and ran over and looked at the computer where she'd just received this email, not knowing in error, that said, "Hi, honey, it's me." Remember, she just lost her husband.
Oh.
And it said, "I'm not actually where I thought I would be, but since I have internet here, I thought I'd drop you a note." It's as hot as hell. But we're all ready for your arrival in just a couple of days' time. So, as I say, irrespective of regulation. Please, a round of applause for both Gary and Ben for taking part in this. Bob, thanks for giving the extra minutes to get those questions in. I'm going to invite you back up, and of course I'll be joining you later at the dinner as well.
Thank you.
Again, a round of applause for our panelists and for Riz for a terrific discussion. This is a topic that